We are very excited that we have Jeff Denham here. He is a retired U.S. history and geography teacher from Brookline, and this is his second book. First book that he published was about Greene and Cornwallis down in the
Carolinas.
The Virginia Carolinas. Yeah. So this is the second book about John Quincy Adams, and he's working on the third book in relation to the Revolutionary War and Pennsylvania.
Yep.
All right, great. So really excited for this topic, and thank you so much, Jeff, for being here. So please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Sudbury Historical Society for hosting this evening, as well as Rachel Robinson for all her assistance, and for all of you coming to listen to what I think is a compelling and remarkable story of our nation's sixth president. This particular book looks at Adams through the lens of slavery, specifically John Quincy Adams' relationship to the institution throughout his life. So this is not a standard biography. One other note I'd like to make about this particular time period in American history. A great number of important time periods and events are lost to public knowledge and consumption because they're bookended by other important events. In this instance, the American Revolution on one hand and the Civil War on the other. So those in-between stories between those particular times are, there's a lot there, and this is one of those stories. So before I begin tonight, I wanted to show you this. This is a list of Adams's political and diplomatic accomplishments, and I wanted to give you a sense of his professional life before we began. So arguably, he is one of the most qualified people ever to hold the office of Secretary of State as well as President. And also note the languages in which he was proficient or fluent. It's simply amazing. So that is quite a resume. So this is an up and down type of story, just like anybody else, but there's a lot of action and a lot of fireworks once we get to his congressional career. At first glance, John Quincy Adams is a mere blip on the radar screen in the 19th century. He's often seen as a nondescript one-term president, one in a long list of such presidents. Losing to Andrew Jackson in his re-election bid in 1828, this Adams is mostly lost to the mists of time, unlike his father, who lives on with his reputation intact. Many readers of American history gloss over John Quincy Adams in favor of the founders like Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton, and for obvious reasons. But a more detailed examination of Adams reveals something else. A man of incredible brilliance and vision, a man who struggled with his own demons, wrestled with the issues of the day, and underwent a metamorphosis that was quite uneven and at times frustrating as he navigated a complex political scene in an America that balked at emancipation years before the Civil War. Born on July 11, 1767 in Braintree, now Quincy, the second child and oldest son of Abigail and John Adams, it was clear from an early age that John Quincy was no ordinary boy. His incredible intellect was evident. For example, by the age of 10, his father was asking him to parse lines in Latin. He was also pushed into reading Thucydides, a Greek historian, hoping John Quincy would master it in the original Greek. These are only a few examples from John Quincy's childhood. Adams's personality traits were also beginning to emerge in his teen years. He was seen as impatient, sensitive to criticism, and set in his ways. But of all the influences on young John Quincy, the issue of slavery was another aspect in which his parents' views were clearly communicated to their young son. John and Abigail never owned a slave, nor hired the slaves of others to work their farm. Abigail ruminated on the issue of slavery many times in her letters to John, and it was clear that an anti-slavery position in the family was firmly established. As slavery ebbed in the North, New Englanders began to look at Southern slaveholders with a sanctimonious disdain that amplified the differences between the two regions. Meanwhile, in Europe in 1779, while accompanying his father on a diplomatic mission, Adams began a diary that would eventually grow to 14,000 pages in 51 volumes that would become one of the greatest historical resources in American history. It would consist of a variety of writings, ranging from poetry to current events, as well as self-analysis. As he recorded his experiences, he began to see firsthand the oppression of other people. In June 1781, Adams, only 14 years old, was asked to be the private secretary of Francis Dana, who was appointed minister to Russia. Adams was selected because he spoke fluent French, which was the language of the Russian court, and Francis Dana did not. As he moved across the continent on his 2,500-mile journey from France to St. Petersburg, he commented in his diary about the condition of some of the people he saw. In Poland, he wrote, quote, "All the farmers are in the most abject slavery. They are bought and sold like so many beasts and sometimes changed for dogs and horses," end quote. He saw similar things in Russia. His mother reminded him in a letter to, quote, "Let your observations and comparisons produce in your mind an abhorrence of domination and power, the parent of slavery, ignorance, and barbarism, which places man upon a level with his fellow tenants of the woods," end quote. As he began his ascent to his incredible station in life, his views began to be molded, and this subject of those who were lowly and repressed began to garner great sympathy as well as curiosity. Adams returned from Europe in late 1785 and entered Harvard in 1786. He graduated second in his class and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa in 1787. The same year he graduated, the Constitution was being formulated, and as it turned out, several of the compromises made at the convention would have serious ramifications for the nation. From the ratification of the Constitution in 1789 to the beginning of the 19th century, slavery had expanded across the South and receded in the North. The 1790 census revealed about 550,000 slaves in the South. By 1800, there were over 850,000. In the North, the total had dropped from 40,000 to 36,000. Concessions to slaveholders were made in order to gain support for the final document, and the 3/5 compromise was the most notorious, counting slaves as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation. In addition, the slave trade would not end until 1808, during which time 100,000 more slaves were brought into the Lower South and the Lower Mississippi Valley. Even after the ban was in place, another 50,000 slaves were imported through Spanish Florida and Texas. To make matters worse for enslaved persons, the Fugitive Slave Clause required runaways to be returned to their owners. In the late 1790s, Adams's career was taking off, being appointed minister to the Netherlands in 1794 by George Washington, and then minister to Prussia in 1797. This is Adams when he's about 30 years old. It was during this period that Adams married Louisa Catherine Johnson in 1797. Louisa had an English mother and an American father. She was fluent in French, a musician, composed poetry, and played the harp. She would end up suffering from severe depression and had ill health throughout her life. They eventually had 4 children, only one of which, Charles Francis Adams, would live through adulthood. When Adams returned to Boston in 1801, he would become a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1802 and finally elected U.S. Senator from Massachusetts in 1803. Adams also served as the Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory at Harvard. His career was on the ascent, but he would be tested on a variety of political fronts, and slavery would rear its ugly head once again. Madison appointed Adams minister to the Russian Empire in 1809, and he served in that position until 1814, when he was called upon to help negotiate the treaty to end the War of 1812. At Ghent in Belgium, Adams was very concerned about the issue of impressment of American sailors prior to and during the war. So for those of you who aren't familiar with impressment, the British from the 1790s all the way up through the War of 1812 would come aside American ships on the open ocean. They would board those ships and they would take American sailors and put them on their ships because the British Navy was short of people. So they would just take American sailors, put them on their boats. They would also go into American ports. They'd go into taverns, pull people out of taverns. They'd pull them right off the docks and put them on boats. So this became a huge issue for the United States during this particular time period. But it was his position on returning slaves back to their owners that was the most troubling. In his diary of August 16, 1815, Adams noted that he and his English counterpart, Lord Liverpool, had discussed the return of captive slaves to their rightful owners. Adams wrote, quote, "Our object was the restoration of all property, including slaves, which, by the usages of war among civilized nations, ought not to have been taken. All private property on shore was of that description. It was entitled by the laws of war to exemption from capture. Slaves were private property, end quote. Adams spent years discussing this issue with his British counterparts, but no agreement in the near future was reached. Although the British had made several offers to stem slavery and the slave trade, Adams was intractable on the issue. Up to this point in time, Adams's approach to slavery remained a puzzle despite his family's anti-slavery position. The impressment issue far outweighed any slavery concerns. To Adams, anti-slavery was relegated to an inferior position when Britain asserted its muscle on the high seas. After serving abroad for 9 years, Adams returned to Washington in 1817 to assume the post of Secretary of State under Monroe. The city had changed and was now a slave trading hub. Adams could not avoid enslaved people on a daily basis. They lived a block from a jail that was a holding pen for slaves and lived across the street from a wealthy slave-owning couple who enjoyed a high standard of living at the expense of slave labor. Many physical descriptions of Adams exist at the time he was Secretary of State. He was now 50 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, about 180 pounds, bald with a round face and piercing dark eyes. He had little sense of humor, and some found his exterior to be cold and forbidding. Adams was self-aware and revealed to a friend that he did have a frosty and cool manner. He could be harsh to people he didn't like, didn't reciprocate admiration. But even Adams's harshest critics could not deny what was undeniable. Adams was a hard worker with an integrity few of his contemporaries could match. He was a man of intense self-regulation, able to discipline himself to such an extent he could find time to explore the natural sciences, arts, and humanities. Adams was a scholar, an intense reader, and a deep thinker with a keen analytical mind. The presidency of John Quincy Adams, predictably, was a respite from slavery in one sense, yet it emerged at every turn, and Southerners sensed subtleties in every action Adams took. Adams had proposed a sweeping national program of internal improvements that included roads and canals, the building of astronomical observatories, the financing of scientific explorations, a uniform standard of weights and measures, as well as a national university. On the surface, these appeared to be noble undertakings, but Adams stumbled. His proposals met with palpable opposition, not only in Congress, but with the American people. Adams's lack of political acumen had failed to sense that most Americans wanted less government. Even though Adams's national improvement plans favored the developments of roads, canals, and harbors in the South, many of which would improve transportation of slave-grown products to market, Southerners saw Adams as a harbinger of slavery's demise. By the time the campaign of 1828 arrived, slavery was front and center, but neither candidate addressed it directly. His opponent was Andrew Jackson, and the election of 1828 would be a microcosm of the sectional nature of the country. But Adams had lost step with how politics was conducted. He continued to pursue his antiquated philosophy left over from the revolutionary generation, that personal integrity counted more than any political machinery. Unfortunately for him, Andrew Jackson had moved on to a new scheme of mass party politics. Jackson emerged victorious. If Adams's political life had ended here, his story would have ended in obscurity. Clearly, Adams would not retire peacefully to his Massachusetts farm. He had political scores to settle, but he also had pressing family business. His finances were in disarray, and that, combined with the political loss of 1828, made Adams a difficult person to live with. His temperament affected his relationship with his wife and his children. And to make matters worse, his eldest son, George Washington Adams, committed suicide within a year of his 1828 defeat. Adams was not only tough on the people around him, he was tough on himself as well. His world had collapsed around him, making his election loss look like a minor affair. But retirement to the family farm seemed akin to a death sentence for the former president. Thus, Adams decided to run for a seat in the House of Representatives. A seat from the Plymouth district was available, and Adams ran for it and won. Adams's foray into a new congressional career in the 1830s coincided with a tumultuous time in antebellum America. In the summer of 1831, a Virginia slave named Nat Turner led several dozen slaves and free blacks on a murderous rampage that resulted in the deaths of 60 men, women, and children. William Lloyd Garrison, the Boston Abolitionist, had begun publication of his newspaper, The Liberator. Southerners, acutely aware of his crusades against the institution of slavery, were filled with great agitation and anxiety when Garrison's publication followed so quickly Turner's rebellion. But the abolition of slavery began to loom as the prevailing social reform, as Northerners began to craft a society in which the ideals of the Declaration of Independence were lived out to the fullest extent possible. To make matters worse for Southerners, British abolitionists had pressured Parliament to finally abolish slavery in the British West Indies in 1833, and attention focused on the American South, as the Western world found in the South the ultimate hypocrisy, a free society with a significant portion of its population destined to serve the dominant aristocratic class for eternity. By the time Adams took office, the census of 1830 had revealed some startling numbers. The total number of slaves had increased to 2 million people. The presentation of petitions in Congress was considered a normal practice since the First Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, and most petitions were referred to committees for action or no action at all. So this is an example of a petition that John Quincy Adams or any other representative would get. It's addressed to the House and to the Senate, and in it, the party or parties would make a request of that particular legislator to try to pass some type of law for whatever cause it happened to be. I picked this one today because this is kind of cool. This is 1869. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton wanting the right to vote. So, but anyway, a lot of these came to John Quincy Adams, and they all revolved, most of them revolved around slavery. Interference with the process was unheard of, even when the petition issue raised some degree of controversy among and between its members. But it was on the first day of Congress that Adams shocked his colleagues by presenting 15 petitions signed by inhabitants of Pennsylvania praying for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and moved that the first of them should be read. The petitions asked that the slave trade in the district might become a topic of legislation in Congress. Adams quickly dispensed with that notion and did not support the contents of the petition. But Adams had opened a figurative door with his 5 minutes on the floor of the House. For the first time in many years, the specter of abolitionism entered the House, and although ignored for many years, it would never again be relegated to obscurity. His lack of a firm position on slavery created doubt on both sides of the issue. Southerners thought he sided with the abolitionists, while abolitionists were skeptical. For Adams, the time was approaching when the collision of worlds would require him to take a stand. For decades, slavery had been debated and compromised. In a letter to his son Charles in December 1835, Adams acknowledged he was in a fateful position. "The voice of freedom has not yet been heard," Adams wrote, "and I am earnestly urged to speak in her name. She will be trampled underfoot if I do not, and I shall be trampled underfoot if I do." Adams ended his rhetorical query, "What can I do?" Curiously, while Adams did not seek out abolitionists, they sought him out. By the end of the year, Adams had met or corresponded with some of the key abolition-minded people of the time. But his oratorical skills on the floor of the House, as well as his belief in the constitutional right of petition, made Adams the obvious conduit through which many abolitionists believed they could succeed. It would just be a matter of time, many abolitionists probably thought, before Adams could be wooed across that seemingly large philosophical crevasse. But Southerners were digging in. They believed the abolitionists needed to be stopped before any possible slave insurrections could tear apart the fabric of Southern society. On January 4th, 1836, Adams presented the petitions of 153 inhabitants of Millbury, Massachusetts, praying for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Adams was instantly interrupted by his neighbor, John Patton of Virginia, who inquired whether the petition had been received, in other words, in the clerk's hands. To which the speaker answered it had not. Thomas Glasscock of Georgia then moved that the petition not be received, and 2 days later, on January 6th, Glasscock presented a resolution in which, quote, "Any attempt to agitate the questions of slavery in this House is calculated to disturb the compromises of the Constitution, to endanger the Union, and if persisted in, to destroy by a servile war the peace and prosperity of this country, end quote. It was becoming clear to Adams and to others that it was no longer feasible to dispose of petitions to committees as before, as Southerners began to react to petitions on slavery in the district with hostility. Suppression of petitions would be the next step, and the constitutionality of such a step was clearly at issue. Adams was a firm believer in the First Amendment, and he believed the government had a constitutional obligation to not only receive the petitions, but to respond to them as well. By early February, Henry Pinckney of South Carolina had also proposed a resolution that a special committee be set up to receive all anti-slavery petitions. All petitions related to slavery in any way were to be laid on the table and no action taken. The resolution was passed, and thus Adams had been essentially gagged. With the passage of the Pinckney resolutions, known as the Pinckney Gag Rule, all debate about slavery was cut off. Southerners and their Northern Democratic allies had outnumbered the Northern Whigs in the voting, but this coalition had not counted on the resolve of abolitionists nor John Quincy Adams. So just to give everybody an idea about the two political parties I just talked about at the time, we've got the Democratic Party and we have the Whig Party. So the Democratic Party is nothing like the Democratic Party of today, totally different animal. So the Democratic Party favored limited government spending. They also favored states' rights. They didn't want to interfere with the spread of slavery anywhere in the United States. And most of the constituency of the Democratic Party were made up of immigrants, farmers, and non-skilled workers. So the Whigs, which is the party that John Quincy belonged to, supported internal improvements. They also favored westward expansion and modernization, and were mostly made up of middle-class people and skilled workers. So that gives you an idea of the two parties. Abolitionists flooded Congress with petitions after the Pinckney Gag Rule was passed. The American Anti-Slavery Society drastically increased its petition campaign, increasing the number of petitions sent to Congress from 23,000 in December of 1835 to 300,000 by May of 1836. Adams knew that he had embarked on a great crusade, but at the same time seemed unsure of its direction. "This is a cause upon which I am entering at the last stage of my life," he wrote, "and with the certainty that I cannot advance in it far. My career must close, leaving the cause at the threshold. To open the way for others is all that I can do. The cause is good and great," end quote. Adams still remained reticent to publicly support the abolitionist cause. Although he met with them in his office and would attend gatherings with them, he remained genial and respectable, but the relationship was more complicated. Adams considered their tactics bordering on dangerous and found them to be lacking in political acumen. He saw them as agitating the issue in such a way that they appeared to be zealots who were out of step with Adams's vision of how the human condition was to be improved. For Adams, the process was important. Politically, he could never go further than what public opinion in the North and his constituency would tolerate. He knew if he went too far, he would not get reelected, and the cause of the anti-slavery movement would potentially be damaged for the long term. One of the most underrated and understated events in Adams's life is the case of Dorcas Allen, a tragic story that gets short shrift in most biographies of Adams. In 1837, Dorcas Allen was a free black woman living in the Georgetown section of Washington, D.C. However, her legal status was unclear. The husband of her deceased former owner had failed to free her legally, and without manumission papers, Allen would be considered a slave without the proper documentation. That is exactly what happened. Allen and her 4 children were transported to slave pens in Alexandria, where they would be shipped down to New Orleans or Mississippi. Allen, knowing what the future held for them, killed 2 of her children, was about to kill the other 2 when the authorities intervened. Tried in court, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Nonetheless, she was now about to be sold, and Adams, who was following the case, went to the slave pen to investigate himself. When he arrived, he was faced with the stark reality of slavery in all its horror and abject misery. Adams never would or could ever be the same. The years of presenting petitions from faceless people from distant corners of the country proved nothing but theoretical compared to what he saw in that auction house. Adams noted in his diary, quote, "the woman weeping and wailing most piteously," end quote. Dorcas and her remaining children were sold to her husband Nathan for $475, but the sale was voided because she could not come up with the money. Adams pledged $50 toward her freedom. Adams was left with little choice. Unlike his earlier years, where slavery was an abstract concept that was subordinated to national strength and constitutional conformity. This had been a reality for Adams that struck him square in his Puritan soul. Curiously, Adams never again wrote in his diary about this incident, and fortunately, Allen was eventually freed in 1838. The saga of the Amistad case began in August 1839 when the Daily Herald, out of New Haven, Connecticut, reported that, quote, "a long, low, black-looking schooner," end quote, had evaded authorities along the coast for several weeks and was, quote, "found derelict and taken possession of and carried into New London." In late June, two men by the names of Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montez arrived at a Havana barracoon, which is a holding pen for slaves, to purchase slaves for work on the plantations at Puerto Principe on the northeast coast of Cuba, a Spanish colony at the time. Between the two of them, they bought 49 adult males and 4 young children. None of the African captives spoke Spanish. They only spoke an obscure African language. Nevertheless, the passports were in false Spanish names with a description of each captive. On the night of June 28th, the cargo was loaded onto the Amistad and set sail. During the voyage, a 25-year-old African from present-day Sierra Leone, called Cinque in Spanish, became concerned about the fate of himself and his companions. While on deck for fresh air, Cinque used sign language to ask the cook what was going to happen to the Africans. He indicated the Africans were to be killed by the Spaniards. Cinque, faced with the ultimate horror, had little choice but to execute a rebellion. Thus, on the 4th day out, it began. The captain and the cook were killed along with 2 crewmen, and Cinque, along with 2 other Africans, took control of the ship. With food and water supplies dwindling, Cinque anchored the Amistad off Montauk Point on the eastern end of Long Island after a long and winding trip northward. Here, while wandering on the shore, the Africans, the schooner, and its cargo were seized and then taken into New London, Connecticut. Cinque and the others were charged with murder and piracy, and they were sent to jail in New Haven. The trial in the district court in New Haven began in January, and the problem the administration, which is now the Van Buren administration, hoped would disappear, created a national sensation. The captives were determined to be free men who were illegally kidnapped in Africa, transported to Cuba under false pretenses, and were to be delivered to the president and sent back to Africa. The district attorney appealed the decision to the circuit court. The circuit court agreed with the district court. So the case was appealed to the Supreme Court. In November 1840, days after Adams was reelected to a 6th term in Congress, abolitionists Ellis Loring and Lewis Tappan called on Adams at his Quincy home to officially bring him into the fold for the Amistad defense team. He had been a consultant up to this point, but now he was asked to be assistant counsel to Roger Baldwin in defense of the Africans before the Supreme Court. Adams, his infirmities increasing, believed that this would be his last great contribution to society and the nation as a whole. On the first day of the trial, Attorney General Gilpin for the government contended that the Amistad was a regularly documented Spanish schooner employed in the coasting trade between the different ports of Cuba, that the passports of the passengers were regularly signed by the Governor General of Cuba, and proved beyond all controversy that the blacks were the property of Ruiz and Montez. There was no question that according to the Treaty of 1795, the slaves must be turned over as the property of Spain. Roger Baldwin carefully made his way through the account of September 1839. He questioned the United States' involvement in this case, as, quote, the question of freedom or slavery was an issue only between Ruiz and Montez and the Africans. On February 24th, 1841, it was Adams's turn, and this is a drawing of the Supreme Court. For 2 sessions, Adams's main thrust was the actions of the executive branch, although he certainly took slaveholders in the slave trade to task as well. He accused the executive branch of having sympathy, along with a large portion of the population, for slave traders against, quote, these poor, unfortunate, helpless, defenseless Africans, end quote, which was the main motivation behind the proceedings they were now engaged. Dramatically pointing to a copy of the Declaration of Independence hanging on one of the pillars in the court, which is this right here, he fell back on this key document, as he had done time and time again. I know of no law, statute, or constitution, no code, no treaty applicable to the proceedings of the executive or the judiciary except that law, Adams exclaimed. What greater violation of the oath of office, Adams said, than to cooperate with a foreign government and deliver a cargo of men under the guise of slaves? The Declaration of Independence remained the central tenet in the case, and the president, Martin Van Buren, was, quote, profoundly ignorant of the self-evident truths, which was a willful and corrupt perjury to his presidential oath, end quote. Every man has a right to life and liberty, an inalienable right, Adams added. This case is decided. I ask nothing more on behalf of these unfortunate men. Adams has shown that the blacks were free, the papers were absolutely null and void as passports for persons, and still more invalid to convey or prove a title to property, end quote. It wasn't until March 9th that Judge Joseph Story delivered the verdict. The Supreme Court decided in favor of the Africans, acknowledging that they had been kidnapped and transported illegally. Adams's arguments had helped win the freedom of the captives. The freed Africans were transported to Farmington, Connecticut, where abolitionists provided housing, education, and the necessary fundraising for the passage across the Atlantic. Eventually, Tappan and other abolitionists raised enough money to outfit a ship to take them back, and at the end of the year, the 35 remaining survivors, as well as 5 missionaries, returned to Sierra Leone. Most reunited with their families and disappeared into history. Not to be forgotten, however, is that Adams's appeal exposed a crevasse between the words of the Declaration and those of the Constitution. At the beginning of the congressional session in 1841, Adams once again attacked the gag rule, which again passed, but this time by only 4 votes, with 30 Northerners voting for it. As these margins began to wear away, Southerners were beginning to realize that the old man was breaking down the pro-slavery coalition in Congress. It was just a matter of time, and the animosity toward Adams was growing. On January 25, 1842, Adams once again ruffled the feathers of the Southern contingent. He presented a petition from Benjamin Emerson and 45 others from Haverhill, Massachusetts, to, quote, peaceably dissolve the Union because of a lack of reciprocal benefits, as the resources of one section of the Union is annually drained to sustain the views of another section without any adequate return, resulting in utter destruction, end quote. Slavery was not directly mentioned. Adams coolly suggested that the petition be referred to a select committee to determine why the prayer ought not to be granted. The House exploded. Henry Wise of Virginia asked the Speaker whether it was in order to censure Adams. A move was made to adjourn, but Adams would have none of it. He wanted the issue settled right now. Thomas Gilmer of Virginia rose and submitted a resolution of censure. Adams said that he hoped the resolution would be received and debated, and that he should have the opportunity to address the House in his own defense. The next day, the issue was continued. Thomas Marshall of Kentucky had written his own resolution. And for Marshall, in the last few days, quote, scenes had been enacted which had presented the American Congress to the world in a light equally discreditable to the country and themselves, end quote. He could not believe that, quote, there were men wild enough and mad enough to make a proposition that the government of the United States should terminate its own existence and then submit it to the members of the House, inviting them to commit perjury and moral treason, end quote. Now, you have to realize at this time, Adams has no intention of trying to peacefully dissolve the Union. He's got a motive behind his madness, and he is going to take the Southerners to task momentarily. After Marshall was finished, it was Adams's turn. The stage was set for the confrontation. The spacious galleries were filled to their utmost capacity, and all approaches to the hall were crowded with anxious men and women endeavoring to get where they could hear the proceedings, wrote Joshua Giddings of Ohio, a fellow representative. Adams began his week-long defense. There were no holds barred on this issue. There was too much at stake. Failure to censure Adams and to keep the gag rule in place certainly would be viewed as a setback for Southerners. Thus, much hinged on this moment. Giddings wrote that Adams was impassioned and his invective unrivaled. But his description of Adams's attack on Marshall is worth the entirety of the following passage. When Mr. Adams came to Marshall in his charge of high treason and presenting a petition, he suggested the propriety of returning to Kentucky to commence the study of law. He made an allusion to his habits of immorality and expressed an earnest desire that he might reform. He then proceeded to the work of torture. As he continued his remarks, he became more and more aroused, and drawing one arrow from another from his well-stored quiver, he sent them with unerring aim into the flesh of his victim, with no other apparent object than to see him writhe under the affliction. His eloquence became more glowing, and his invective became more impassioned, until his assailant was utterly demolished, and then he resumed his seat. A painful silence ensued. Marshall was standing some 30 feet from Mr. Adams, but no effort could disguise the evidences of his humiliation. He declared afterwards that he would have rather suffered death than the torment to which he had been subjected. It was chastisement as terrible as it was deserved, and it was not possible that he could ever forget it. That's Joshua Giddings' diary entry. By February 7th, Adams was sensing the House had had enough of these proceedings. The country had enough as well. Cracks were appearing in the Southerners' armor. Adams' support in the North was increasing, both in the press and the public, and petitions against the attempt to censure Adams flooded the House. The coalition between Southerners and their Northern allies was eroding. Allowing Adams to have the floor unfettered was a massive miscalculation, and the wily Adams took full advantage of it. He now announced that it would take another week to conclude. However, he would, quote, be willing to stop short and dismiss the subject from the consideration of the House forever. John Botts of Virginia moved to table the resolutions to censure Adams, and the House voted 106 to 93 to lay the issue on the table. It was another victory for Adams. It was clear that Adams had been moving slowly along the anti-slavery continuum. His relations with many of his abolitionist acquaintances surely influenced him along the way. But in any case, Adams, who once just fought for the constitutional right of petition, was now fighting for the extinction of slavery. Although he never allied himself with abolitionists publicly, privately it was another story. In his private notes for a speech on the annexation of Texas, he declared himself an abolitionist. Quote, if the most ardent desire and a most vivid hope of the total extinction of slavery on earth constitutes an abolitionist, I am one, to the extent of readiness to lay down my life in the cause, end quote. On December 2nd, 1844, the first day of the new session, Adams made it known that the next day he would move to rescind the gag rule. On the 3rd, he introduced his resolution. Jacob Thompson of Mississippi moved to lay the resolution on the table, but the motion to lay it on the table was rejected. The resolution to rescind the gag rule was finally passed 108 to 80. Adams had done it. The gag rule was no longer. The 77-year-old Adams, the madman from Massachusetts, as they called him down south, up here he was old man eloquent. The bane of existence to Southern slaveholders had, in that single moment, through sheer perseverance and resolve, had won his finest triumph in his congressional career. His triumphs, however, were short-lived, for in 1845, Texas was annexed to the United States, and war was on the horizon with Mexico. For Adams, though, he was bumping up against the ravages of time. He suffered a stroke in November 1846 and did not return to Congress until February 1847. Adams's physical maladies had limited his level of productivity. On February 21st, 1848, Adams delivered his last words on the floor of the House. Suddenly, a cry was heard near Adams's desk. "Mr. Adams is dying." Adams started to fall to his left, but was caught by another member sitting next to him. It was remembered that a great sensation was created in the House, members from all quarters rushing from their seats and gathering around the fallen statesman. A sofa was brought in, and Adams was placed on it and was carried to the chambers of the House Speaker, Robert Winthrop of Massachusetts. While there, Adams spoke briefly. "This is the end of earth," he said, and that added, "I am composed." Louisa rushed to the scene, but could do nothing for her husband. But Adams continued to grow weaker and weaker until on Wednesday evening, February 23rd, 1848, he expired without a struggle. It is noteworthy to remember that when Adams collapsed in the house, in the back row of the chamber sat a tall, bony man, 6 feet 4 inches tall, homely, and whose careless habits of dress detracted from his appearance. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Thus, the torch had been passed. And with that, I shall conclude. Thank you very much.
How old was he when he passed away?
He was 80.
He was 80.
Yes, he was 80. Yes. He is, this is a, he's in the crypt underneath the First Parish Church in Quincy. His father, Abigail, John, and Louisa Catherine are all buried there right in a row. But that's his crypt right there. So if you're going to downtown Quincy, the Unitarian Church, right to the basement, and they actually do tours down there as well. Yeah, so it's pretty cool. Yes, ma'am.
Did John Quincy Adams have any perspective, either for or against, or, I don't know, some different idea about the American Colonization Society?
Yes, that's in my book too. So in 1817, the American Colonization Society began. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to take all free blacks and transport them across the Atlantic to Liberia. And they also were hoping to count on slaveholders at some point to release their slaves and send them across the ocean as well. So this began in 1817 when Adams was Secretary of State, and it was brought to his attention. And people came to him and said, "Hey, John, what do you think about this?" He goes, "No, we're not. This is a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea for all parties involved." And actually, when the free blacks heard about it, they didn't like it either. They didn't want to go to Africa. They wanted to stay here. This was their home. So there was a big movement underway, and some of the most interesting people are involved in this movement. James Madison, James Monroe, Thomas Jefferson, and a name you've heard in the last couple of weeks, Francis Scott Key. Okay? So all of those people are involved in this colonization movement. So in cabinet meetings in the White House, this is coming up, and Adams is putting the kibosh on this. This is just not going to happen. The United States is not going to allocate any money to this, and that's basically essentially having a colony on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. This is not acceptable on any way. So morally, it's not correct. In terms of international relations and politics and economics, not going to happen. So he has approached multiple times to contribute to the society. He sends people packing. And sometimes he ends up with debates in his office. He debates somebody for 2 hours, and the person walks away and they just skulk away because they just can't get the better of him. So that was a big movement.
Did he have other suggestions on how to handle what their perspectives were, or their
Well, what Adams did do in 1839, he attempted, and it failed obviously given the composition of the Congress. He proposed a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery, and it was a three-part piece, and of course it was shot down. But he was trying to figure out, how can we do this that's not going to end in a war? Because he actually predicted in 1835 that if this thing isn't solved, this is going to turn into a civil war. And he said that 15, 16 years before the actual Civil War started, because you could see it coming. The pressure was building. Both sides were not moving on the issue. So unless some agreement was going to come about some aspect of slavery, it was going to come to blows. and that's exactly what happened. And the 1850s are even more contentious than the 1830s and 40s. So it was tough. And Adams was doing I brought up the annexation of Texas before. Texas was a huge issue in the 1830s. So Adams gets wind that Southerners are interested in moving slavery southwestward into Texas. And Adams gets wind of this, and he sends out all his cronies to get information. So they get information, and they come back with this information that Texas is so big that there's a possibility it could be divided into 6 or 7 states eventually, all slave states. And then that's going to continue to carry all the way to the Pacific. And Adams spends from 1836, when he finds out about it, to 1844, he spends fighting the annexation of Texas to the United States for this very reason. So he spent 8 years, but it was unsuccessful. In 1845, Texas joins the Union. But he was disgusted.
Did anybody think, rather than sending people over to Africa, send them back to Africa, did anybody think of the idea of making an entirely black state for free states here?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I mean it was inevitable that slavery was going to end because it was just becoming such a problematic institution, and it was becoming antiquated, and even Southerners knew it was becoming antiquated. You know, Adams is proposing all these national improvements, and what Southerners were afraid of, especially during his presidency, is that if you start putting these improvements into place and the country starts moving forward in terms of its infrastructure and trade and all these good things, slavery is going to just fall by the wayside. It's an antiquated institution already, but now it's going to disappear. And Southerners know it, but they want to hold on to it, and they don't want to let go. And so this is...
Was the idea that it wouldn't be needed with all of the improvements that were coming, or?
Eventually, yes, because all that stuff would be, increased population, increased jobs, and, all these things to build these infrastructures. So, the workforce was going to grow. You needed a workforce. But Southerners sensed that Adams was always up to something, even when he wasn't up to something. They were a little paranoid about him. But in actuality, he was working to try to figure out how to do this. And talk about heated. William Lloyd Garrison, he wrote a letter to Adams, just steaming mad when he refused to stop to try to figure out a way to end slavery in the District of Columbia. Garrison wrote him this nasty letter. It's really quite something. And he says, basically, what are you doing? Either slavery's wrong or it's not wrong. And if it's wrong, why would you continue it? So you had a group that was for immediate emancipation, and then you had another group that was for gradual emancipation. So those two groups were working in conflict with each other. So, yes, ma'am.
Grew up within walking distance of the Adams houses, so they've always fascinated me. And I never could understand much about John Quincy, except sometimes you read that, well, he always kind of irritated people.
Well, when you look at, wait a second, let me go back. When you look at that face, that pretty much tells it all, right? That's what you see is what you get. And here's the thing about perception of people, especially historical figures. A lot of people are defined by their presidency, right? That's how we rate presidents, we rate people. But the presidency seems to be this one tool. But there's so many other things that go on, and especially in his life, if you look at all his diplomatic accomplishments, there isn't a Secretary of State from present time going back that has the qualifications that he had. By the time he was 21 years old, he saw more of the world than anybody in the United States. He was in numerous countries, in Great Britain, in France, in Holland, in Russia, in Prussia, He was all over the place. That's why he spoke 8 languages as well. But he had a perspective, European perspective, American perspective, and this made him such a qualified person. So, yes.
Yeah, when I saw on your schedule what he did, he went from being the president into the House.
Yes.
And I looked at that and I said, what? Is that? I mean, I've never heard of that.
That's because no one else has ever done it except for him. He's the only one. Yep, the only one.
Well, where are his diaries now and some of his other correspondence?
Okay, his diaries, the actual diaries are at the Mass Historical Society. But you also can get his diaries are also in book form. They're in various college libraries in the area. And you can also look at the diaries online as well. So the Mass Historical Society has a digital collection where you can call up any diary from any place and see the whole thing. So it's quite an extensive thing. And you see a lot of what he's thinking about, because he writes down everything, what he's thinking goes on paper. And you see him, he takes religious services and he dissects the sermon of the minister. And he goes, well, that's not what that passage means in the Bible. No, that's not what that means. It means this. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It's really hilarious as Adams is talking about these things in his diary. He does it all the time. He's constantly thinking, challenging, and it really is. His thoughts on religion and the different denominations, it's quite humorous.
Did he ever write horn books, legal horn books at all?
The what?
Did he ever write any legal horn books, interpretations of the law?
Not that I was looking at, because I was looking specifically at slavery. Yes, ma'am.
Have you actually been able to look and hold one of his diaries?
It really is. I'd love to do that. No, I've not been able. No, I just get the digital version. Yeah, but I would love to do that. But
You wouldn't want to pick it up by hand.
yeah, I know. But it really is quite something. 14,000 pages. And it's,
You can go hold his dad's books at the museum.
yeah,
Some of them still have the bird poop on them.
yeah.
Stashed in the steeple.
But look at those books. You ever been to the Old Stone Library at the Adams Peacefields? That's 12,000 volumes. I think there's 12 different languages that are represented in those books, and that's John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Charles Francis Adams, Henry Adams, and one more Adams. But it's just incredible the amount of reading that these people did.
Where did you say that was?
At the Peacefield in Quincy, the big retirement home I showed you. Yeah, it's right adjacent to the house. Yeah, so it's quite something. Anything else?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
You titled him Reluctant Abolitionist, although to a certain extent it sounds like, at least for the last 20 years of his career, he was pretty far along that way. He just didn't do it the same way the more famous abolitionists did.
Well, I titled it that way because he wasn't this way from the start. Actually, when he came back to the United States, he was very silent about what was going on in the country, like during the Louisiana Purchase, the Missouri Compromise, all these things that involved slavery. He's saying nothing publicly. He's writing stuff in his diary. He's having a conversation with his diary, but nothing is going out into the general public or even his colleagues. He does write this 5 essays about the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution. And he does quite a job on that, and he attacks Southerners and what the 3/5 compromise not only means for slaves, but also how it's created an imbalance in the Congress, and Southerners are getting more representatives in Congress than Northerners because you've got the 3/5 compromise in place. And the North is not getting the say it should say in the legislative process. So he's doing some stuff, but he's not there yet. It's taking time. Question? Oh, okay. So it's taking a lot of time.
Could you expand a little bit more on why the Southerners were realizing that slavery was anachronism? Because being down in the Charleston area, that was a rice growing area. They supplied the British Army with rice. It was labor intensive. A lot of the technology was, brought by the slaves. And so, and also the cotton industry. So, maybe better transportation, but why would that undercut the essential role of slaves in that market?
Why would what undercut it?
Well, in other words, you said that slavery was becoming less practical. And I'm just wanting to see if you could expand on that a little bit, why it was becoming impractical.
The evolution of our society was moving forward, and people were becoming more enlightened with the way they viewed race and slavery, and people's philosophies were evolving. And at the time, you've got people who were listening to the great Enlightenment thinkers of the late 18th century, early 19th century, and they're thinking about things in a different way, and they're thinking in terms of not politics, but also economics and also morality and all these different areas. And this is, as society begins to grow and build, and they start thinking about some of the, like Adams is always going back to the Declaration of Independence. And those tenets are extremely important. Slavery, if all men are created equal, is antithetical to what's going on in the Declaration of Independence. So if we're going to adhere to the ideas and ideals of a document, then we're going to have to do something to bring that to fruition.
I understand what you're saying now.
Yeah.
It was more societal, it wasn't economic. Because economics favored slavery.
Right, right. Well, there were more slaves in South Carolina than there were free people.
Yeah.
So it was.
So, what you're talking about is a societal change.
You're right. It was a sweeping, it was a sweeping, even though people's racial attitudes in that period of time is not great. It certainly was not good. A lot different than it is today, but still not very good. But still, most people thought that blacks should be free. A lot of times they didn't think that they were equal to whites. So we have this little dichotomy going on. Yeah, you should be free, but see you later, right? Like, you're not my equal. And other people would disagree with that at the time as well.
Was slavery discussed in the background, so to speak, when they were trying to formulate the Declaration of Independence?
It was just not, no, it was discussed in the background at the Constitutional Convention. And that's where things got really sticky. Because without Southern support, the Constitution would never have been ratified. It just wouldn't have happened.
As far back as maybe not the Declaration, but the Constitution.
Yeah, without Southern support, the Constitution never would have been passed. And John Adams, who was instrumental in moving things towards the Constitutional Convention, even though he wasn't there, he was doing a lot of compromising with Southerners in terms of slavery. You see in the diaries, the letters, Abigail says a lot of stuff, but John's not really saying a lot because he's doing a lot of compromising in the back rooms. He's trying to get a deal together to make things work for the new country. And, unless there's a compromise, and you see some of these compromises like the Three-Fifths Compromise, it has devastating effects for decades.
One of the biggest calls on the use of slaves, obviously, was the cotton industry.
Right.
And it's my understanding that there was very limited natural inland running water that would have been used to run any kind of mills that would like clean and process the cotton.
No, the Carolinas were loaded with waterways. Their waterways crisscross all over the place. Yeah, so there were tons of waterways down there. But rice and indigo on the coastal areas were huge. Cotton was more inland in the Piedmont area and stuff like that.
There was still a lot of cotton that was shipped north to
Yes,
be processed.
correct.
People being sent over to Europe.
Yep.
Was there any consideration of maybe boycotting that process in the north? to force them to shut down a little bit there?
No, because there's so much interplay between making money, economics, it's all about
Like
money.
During the revolution, it-
No, the revolution, no, it was definitely not.
different, I don't mean about cotton, but like during the revolution, women decided to spin their own fabric.
Right.
Like that.
Well, that was also because of non-importation, non-consumption agreements too that they had, so women would be doing their own stuff instead of getting it from elsewhere.
Right, but there was no consideration of trying to find a different way to get by rather than to assist in that part of it.
Not at that time, no. The revolution became the centerpiece of everything.
No, I mean, after the revolution.
Oh, after?
Was there any similar type of thing to try to circumvent that?
No, I mean, the U.S. had tariffs, and a couple times they increased the tariff, and that would cause imported goods to be more expensive, and that's what Southerners were getting their manufactured goods from through overseas. And the problem is if you put high tariffs on manufactured goods, then on the other side of the ocean, Great Britain is going to do retaliatory tariffs on cotton. And so that's what happened in the early 1830s and so they ended up having a battle in the Congress.
Did that all feed into the War of 1812?
No, that was afterwards. But
I'm wondering what inspired you to choose to write about John Quincy and
well, before I did any research, I read 3 biographies, and I noticed that in all 3 biographies that I read, slavery was just predominantly mentioned in the latter part of his life. And I was wondering, well, what goes on in the beginning of his life? What goes on in the middle of his life? So I wanted to take a look at some of those other things and what he was thinking, what he was doing, and try to get a whole picture of him from beginning to end. So.
Did you run across any correspondence or relationship between John Quincy and our local abolitionists with Mariah Giles?
No. Oh, wait a second. Yes. I think I have something in my. So many letters I looked at. I can't.
Lydia Mariah Child.
Yeah, I can't remember, but she's also mentioned in the book as well.
Because she was often at loggerheads with Harrison.
Yeah, I know it. So anyway, thank you so much for coming, everybody. If anybody would like a copy of the book, I will be up here. Cash or Venmo works. So whichever works for you works for me. So thank you so much.